Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. The first hour, we're going to look at some issues in the news. Next hour, we will have Dr. Jim Denison in studio with us. One of his pieces has to do with how do we plan for an uncertain future, using the example of this tragic story of a building collapse in Florida to be able to give us some biblical principles we can apply there. And we'll get into a variety of other topics that he has addressed in the next hour. But this hour, in just a few minutes, I do want to talk about what some people are calling the COVID class system. And this is one which I'll get into in the next segment because it's fairly lengthy. Just a reminder of having gone through the pandemic and the lockdown, it has created some precedents that aren't necessarily positive in terms of essential workers, non-essential workers, the term inessential, which I had not really thought about, which is another one. And then, of course, just the justification now that when we face any kind of tragedy, the government has been given almost complete carte blanche permission to just close down the economy and the implications that might have for the future. So we'll talk about that. Of course, there looks like there's going to be a real backlash to what's happening in the border and how that can affect not only the Biden administration, but the next elections. Critical race theory, how the press sometimes does not cover it. Matter of fact, even going after people that actually report that. So we will cover some of those issues. We'll talk about the issue of entitlements, a travel ban, and a number of other topics. But I thought before we get into the big stories here, I would take on two small ones that are both fairly relevant. And one has to do with this ongoing debate about where the virus came from the Wuhan Institute for Virology. Now, again, I'm not necessarily trying to drive the point. I'm bringing this up because when you hear a faulty argument, it's worth responding to. And the argument that's now being made is, well, wait a minute, you guys are jumping too quickly to the assumption that the virus came from the Institute of Virology. Well, there seems to be a lot of circumstantial evidence, but the argument that is being used right now is, quote, it took many years to trace the SARS virus back to an animal. Thus, it's going to take a long time to trace this virus to wherever it came from. Wrong, because it turns out that if you just go to something we've cited before, the MIT Technology Review, it was actually the origin of that SARS virus, and this is back in 2003, when it spread from southern China, and about 8,000 people were sick from it. Nothing like, of course, what we had with COVID-19, but nevertheless, during that time, researchers fairly quickly were able to identify an animal that had an identical virus because they caged a number of these market animals from the wet market and found a nearly identical virus in a Himalayan palm civet cat. Okay, you're going to have to look that up on Wikipedia, see what it's like. And then also found it in what are called raccoon dogs, and you don't have to get into all the details. So this one came possibly and more likely from a wet market and was easily and quickly identified. So it's just a good example of sometimes when people throw off a little slogan like, well, it took a long time to find the virus that was responsible for the SARS outbreak in 2003. No, it didn't. And a quick check of some various facts will show that that's a great slogan, but it is not accurate. So anyway, just thought I would spend a moment on that because you will hear that in the news, and I just want you to have some discernment and maybe a little bit of skepticism when people make statements, though, that are so blatantly incorrect as that. For a moment, I want to talk to those of you in Georgia, but whether you live in Georgia or not, because we broadcast in a lot more states than Georgia, obviously, we do have a lawsuit that was brought by the Justice Department, and the person really pushing this is the Assistant Attorney General Kristen Clark, who's pretty radical and coming after Georgia. Now, the problem with this lawsuit is, first of all, it alleges that this particular election reform law, that's SB 202, was actually done with malice. In other words, it was intentionally trying to prevent African Americans from voting. And then they make the case that it violates the 1965 Voter Rights Act. Now, there are all sorts of issues that you can raise, but one of those is the fact is the Supreme Court is considering a case very similar to this right now, has to do with the 1965 Voter Rights Act, which they have not ruled on. Now, I don't claim to be a lawyer. I don't play a lawyer on television, but I've been around enough lawyers to know that before you file a lawsuit, you might want to wait a week or two and determine how the Supreme Court's going to rule on a case that could impinge on your filing. Does that make any sense to you at all? And the fact that this was rushed shows how partisan it was in the first place. There's also another issue that needs to be mentioned as well, because there was another case that was decided in the 11th Circuit Court. And the 11th Circuit Court, in case you do not know, not only deals with, in this particular case, a case out of Alabama, but also governs Georgia. And so last year in the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, it threw out a lawsuit against Alabama, making some of the very same arguments being made against Georgia. So you've got a 1-2 punch. Number one, the Justice Department didn't wait long enough to actually see what the Supreme Court was going to rule on one case that might impinge on their filing. And number two, a year ago, the lawsuit that came in the 11th Circuit Court was thrown out. And so if you don't think this has a partisan element to it, well, you just have to go and look into some of the details. The reason I bring this up is for those of you in Georgia saying, oh my goodness, we're going to get sued. Yes, you are. I have real questions at how that merit of that suit is going to go, but you can begin to see the partisan nature of it. And for those of you that live in states outside of Georgia, your legislature, I live in the state of Texas, they've been considering an election reform law right now, and you may have been in one of the other states that received this broadcast. You might say, well, maybe we need to kind of wait and see what happens with this Justice Department lawsuit. And I think the answer is no, probably not. Matter of fact, one of the contentions in this case, this one still makes me smile, is that in this particular election reform law from Georgia, it would require that individuals request an absentee ballot at least 11 days before Election Day. I don't think that hurts you, whether you're black, white, brown, whatever. And it is interesting because this particular lawsuit fails to mention that the United States Postal Service sent a letter this last year to every state, including to the Secretary of State in Georgia, strongly recommending that the states change their deadline for voters to request an absentee ballot, and saying that an optimal deadline would be at least 15 days. So unless you're convinced that there are all sorts of mean-spirited people in the Postal Department, what they're simply trying to say is, if you don't request a ballot early enough and then mark it, it will then get mailed and maybe actually show up too late to get actually recorded. So these are the kinds of things that are developing right now in the Justice Department, and I think, frankly, we should be a little bit embarrassed by the way in which some of these lawsuits are being brought, because they're becoming more and more obviously partisan. But anyway, just a couple of quick things I wanted to mention that I've come across, but when we come back, I want to talk about our cruel COVID class system. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Most people would expect liberals to be open-minded, and yet they find that they are often the most intolerant. Kim Holmes explores the reason for this transformation in his new book, The Closing of the Liberal Mind. He was on my radio program to talk about the history of the radical change in mindset and attitude. Now, classical American liberalism in this country was based on a belief in liberty. Citizens were to be free from government coercion and thus free to believe something different from the orthodoxy forced on it by the state. They were also free to discuss and debate, and most importantly was a belief in true tolerance, which accepted the right and freedom of others to believe differently from you. It was a live and let live philosophy. I may disagree with your views, but I would defend your right to believe them. That is not the view of the postmodern left today. They practice the politics of intolerance. They may think that they are tolerant, but really live in a world where bigotry and discrimination are allowed against any view that is not politically correct. They are willing to stifle free thought, censor free speech, and use public shaming in order to suppress any idea they do not like. Now, in his book, he talks about the campus bullies, but we also discussed how this has moved into even the business world. Now we have corporate bullies willing to use economic power to stifle and suppress legislation they abhor. He says we have a new ruling class that is wealthy, smart, well-connected, and formidable. Although their numbers are small, actually in the thousands, their influence in the media, in the academy, and in government is significant. They also believe that they have a higher truth which is superior to the common wisdom of the day. You know, we're in a battle with a new kind of liberal mind, and that is why we need to read about the closing of the liberal mind. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, I want to talk for just a few minutes, and I'd really like to get your thoughts. So let me open up the phones, 1-800-351-1212. Do you think that the quarantine and the shutdowns and the lockdowns and everything have had a detrimental effect on your mental health, on the perception we have, maybe even the growth of government? I'd love to get your thoughts about that. And our first article here comes from Michael Brendan Doherty, and he calls it Our Cruel COVID Class System, in which he says that early on, as he began to see some of these policies having to do with the lockdowns and some of the quarantines and all sorts of other things, he had this prayer that he always said, never get used to this. And he says, I was appalled by the culture of snitching that took place in the United Kingdom, where you would call up officials and say, well, I'm concerned about the fact that I saw somebody outside a minute ago without a mask on. The open contemplation, he says, by major Western governments of antibody certificates. Of course, now we're talking about vaccine passports. The U.S. attitude going into lockdown without ever explaining what measures would end and when they would end and those kinds of things. And, of course, reminds us of a number of things, because you had churches that found themselves in trouble if they wanted to meet together. We've even talked about the fact that even meeting outside in cars in something that looked like the old drive-in movies was sometimes seen as controversial, and just the general overreaction at all of this. So he goes on in the second page with some of those details, but I thought I'd pick it up at the bottom of that page by saying that he's really worried that in the future, he says, historians will laugh at us. Over a period of 16 months, we have discovered that governance inspired by Chinese despotism could be practiced in the West in the name of public health. Across the former free world, constitutional rights were enthusiastically violated in the name of saving lives, and the vast majority of people complied happily or even became zealous enforcers themselves. Now, again, I'm not minimizing, nor do I think he minimizes the death rate due to COVID-19, the serious health consequences of that. But I think he wants to move our nose up far enough to begin to look into the future and say, what does this mean in terms of the government, in terms of the willingness of the American people and people in other parts of the world to go along with what in the past would have been seen as a pretty totalitarian regime. And so I'd love to get your thoughts about this. He then goes on to say this is something governments can't unsee. When governments and other powerful entities take a hard look at the wholesale shutdown of businesses and social and even religious institutions, the requirement to work at home if possible, the Zoomification, I guess that's a word, of social life, the suppression of dissenting opinion, and the promotion of government party lines by all major social networks across the globe. What will they see? The tools available for many other problems. And then, before I take some phone calls here, and the calls are already coming in, so if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, he makes some distinctions because this gets back to the title of his piece, A Class System. Now, you can go to other countries and see a very definite, rigid class. We do have some class elements even in America, but it is kind of intriguing to see how this goes. So let me run these real quickly before I take some phone calls. And first of all, you had some of the, quote, experts and lawmakers. They began to categorize all the work under two official labels. Remember those? And then a third one that was never said out loud. But let's look at the first two official ones. You had essential workers, and then you had inessential workers, okay? And essential workers were those who hold jobs that cannot be deep-sixed or slowed down without causing obvious societal dysfunction and deprivation. Inessential workers are those whose work can more or less be performed by computers and telecommunications. And so there was a sense in which, and he uses this idea of the Maslow hierarchy of needs. And if you're not familiar with that, you can actually just type in Maslow and you'll find it, or of course pull out any psychology book that you have around. And it talks about the fact that we as human beings seek food, shelter, safety, but we do that sometimes in a hierarchy, pretty much understood. And so in some societies, he says, like in the United Kingdom, truckers, grocery store workers, and nurses received special esteem because knowledge workers came to recognize their dependence on these essential workers. He says even in the United States, one profession fell in between these two categories, and revealing that there was another one that fits in between essential and inessential. And he says that profession was, and I love this line, public school teachers, who effectively argued that if they were backed by powerful enough teachers' unions, that they were inessential workers who should stay tightly locked down at home and far from their usual work in the classroom. But their argument was that the schools were far too dangerous, that schools were death traps in a way that grocery stores were not. But then, of course, if that were true, it would mean that workers deemed essential, people working in grocery stores, gas stations, and other, were in fact cannon fodder in the war on COVID. And so the essential workers, we're talking about truck drivers and food workers and others, acting as a servant class, making life possible for the supposedly inessential ones. Teachers did not want to be thought of in this way, but many parents who struggle to simultaneously work and proctor Zoom school from home concluded that teachers were in fact more essential than the pizza delivery guy. But he says there's another very significant category, and I'll take some phone calls, and this one was the category of those who were what? Expendable. Most of these workers were in restaurants, bars, in the hospitality industry. The COVID recession hit hardest against the working class women who dominate in these fields. But not all expendable workers were low-wage earners. Expendable workers also included many small business owners and entrepreneurs who operate locally and in person rather than on the internet. It included highly skilled workers such as airplane pilots, many of whom during the lockdowns lost their certification to fly. By the way, I'm hoping to fly out in about a week, and they're saying they're just canceling a lot of flights because they have to recertify all these pilots, and they're not getting certified fast enough. Anyway, it's another side note here. And these workers and businesses have been sustained by the closest thing we've tried to a universal basic income. And the industries that are trying to hire them back are having trouble scaling up because of a labor shortage and the slowness of customers to return to their own habits. This goes on for many pages, but I wanted to, if nothing else, say it does seem to me that we are moving into a different time. But if nothing else, wanted to put this on the table as a discussion point. And then we have a couple of phone calls that have come in. But if you'd like to join us, I'd love to know your thoughts, because in some respects, what he is trying to do is recognize that we have these different classifications: essential, inessential, and then one that I hadn't really thought about, expendable, and the impact that that's having not only just on the economy, but also in some of these professions, and sometimes even in the ability of some of these businesses to even succeed in the future. I live in a world where, as I drive by, many times I see what used to be a thriving restaurant that my family and I went to that does not have any light on anymore, and probably never will again, simply because of some of that shutdown. You can think, well, they were trying to do what they could through making some kinds of deliveries, but those that didn't scale up fast enough, or individuals that did not ask them to send some of the food their way, simply ceased to exist. And if you've walked a mall lately, you've seen a number of other businesses that don't exist any longer as well. So essential, inessential, and expendable. What are your thoughts? Love to get your thoughts, and we'll take some of those phone calls right after the break. But just before we do so, my responsibility, I think today, given the fact that tomorrow is the end of our fiscal year, is to remind you that we do have a banner that says, "Be a Difference Maker." We talked about this yesterday with both of my guests, but again, it is a reminder that as we come to the end of this fiscal year, it's been a difficult year for all of us, and if you certainly are not able to help us financially, I don't want you to feel guilty at all. I'm grateful for that. If nothing else, maybe you can tell us how we can pray for you. But I do know that some of you might be able to help us finish this fiscal year, which ends tomorrow, June 30th, in the black. And if you can help us out, click on that button that says Give Now. We have a matching fund, and it's a dollar for dollar matching fund. You'll see some suggested giving levels, and you can give $50, $100, $250, $500. We've got all sorts of giving suggestions, but whatever you do, it will be doubles. Your gift of $100 becomes $200. Your gift of $500 becomes $1,000. And I'm not asking you to do something I have not already been doing. Matter of fact, I made a significant gift to Gary Bauer, who will be on the program with us tomorrow, and I would encourage you to consider what you might do to support Point of View. Let's take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
We have just over a day remaining to make a difference together for the next 6 months. Many times we've had big opportunities, but this is one of the biggest that I can remember. Special Friends have thrown down a $65,000 challenge. If we can get friends like you to invest right now in Point of View, they will match every gift, dollar for dollar, up to $65,000. Now, compared to major networks and news shows and PBS, $65,000, not a big deal. They spend that in minutes. But for our efforts to combat fake news, to equip you to make a difference, it has rarely been bigger. Our fiscal year-end total will help define how much we can accomplish together for the remainder of 2021. So please step up and invest right now. Make a difference by visiting pointofview.net/difference or call 1-800-347-5151. Make double the difference. Pointofview.net/difference and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Talking just for a few more minutes, if we will, on the COVID class system. Michael Brendan Doherty, it's the first article we've posted here on the website. Just a reminder that in some respects we are dealing with a remarkable change that has taken place in our culture. And as he says, governments can't unsee some of this. They've recognized how useful lockdowns and government intervention can be. And many of us, and I think he is most importantly, fearful of what that could mean in the future. Let's get some phone calls, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. In Georgia, WLPE. Richard, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, Kerby. Good afternoon. How are you doing?
I am good. I'd love to get your comments.
Well, I agree with the three-class system that he mentioned in an article, and it seems like it's more of the draconian methods to push to see the response of the American people, which included religious control, because, you know, if you want to bring in socialism, you have to get rid of religion. It has to go away. And so I agree with that. And then it's a total disregard for human life. I mean, you saw how churches and everybody were treated, but yet the abortion clinics were kept open and things of that nature. And you know that with doing away with religion, you promote evolution. Evolution is a total disregard for human life because it's the survival of the fittest. So it's all a ruse to control us and just dictate to us how you are going to live.
Again, essential, inessential, and expendable. And you're really right on target when you talk about kind of the animus towards religion. I think we recognize that anyway, but going all the way back to Karl Marx, Frederick Engels, and others, religion was seen, as we even talked about last week with Dr. Erwin Lutzer, as the opiate of the people. It's something that really prevented the movement towards this utopian Marxist view. And so that is certainly one aspect of that. And again, what we saw was in kind of vivid color, something we always sort of knew, and that is rules apply to certain elites differently than they apply to us, that we can actually argue that, I don't know, everything, as you said, from abortion clinics to marijuana dispensaries are essential, but somehow churches are not essential. And so those are some issues that I think really need to be addressed. And that's why I thought this article was very helpful. And I've only given you kind of a brief summary of it. But what I think is so striking is that it perhaps gives you a better understanding of how we have developed a little bit of a class structure. And we've talked about this before, when sometimes you have a shutdown of the government, they'll say that we'll only have essential workers working in the government. And just imagine if you're a bureaucrat and say, well, I'm not an essential worker, which has led a lot of people to say, well, if we can run the government with these essential workers, which seem to be about a third of all the workers in the government, why don't we run it all the time that way? So it's something to think about. But let's take some more phone calls. I do want to give each one of you a chance to make your comment, right or wrong, agree or disagree. That's why we call the program Point of View. Let's head out to California, and we'll talk to Sandra. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi. I'm in Blythe, California. We're a declining small community. It's just we have no more Kmart anymore.
Wow.
And they closed the churches, but the liquor store and the marijuana dispensary was open, and only one of our little some of our businesses are not going to open back up.
I'm sure of that.
We do have
And again, your point's well taken. I live right now in the Dallas area, and so there's some benefits of being in a larger community where you get some flow. But I mean, if you're in a smaller town, a smaller city, the devastation is dramatic. And like you said, okay, we lost our Kmart. Now where do we go to get food, clothing, and well, maybe not so much food, but all the other essentials that you can get at a Kmart? And there you go. It just illustrates again. And I'm not saying that we didn't have to do some things, and we were all kind of flying blind for a while about what would be the best way to respond to this pandemic. But I think we want to look down the road and say, what if we have another one? Because already you're hearing this drumbeat about the fact that now we have this Delta variant in COVID-19 and whether or not that could be dangerous. And there will be some other situations. And can we at least learn some lessons from this? And so that's a good issue as well. So, Sandra, thank you for calling. I'm glad you're listening to Point of View. And if you don't mind, I'm going to keep moving because I want to go to Jody now in Georgia. Jody, I think you want to add some comments to some of the things we've been talking about.
Oh, yes. Well, good afternoon. Thank you for having us, letting me talk or share my point of view as well. I'm noticing a lot of people that call and give their point of view, they sound very negatively affected by all this, but I'm very hopeful that things can get better. Not saying that I idolize a lot of these senators and congressmen. They're just people after all. But a lot of them do have common sense and are fighting for us. For example, Mr. Dan Crenshaw, we have a lot of politicians that are more and more thinking like him and just having common sense to put their foot down and stop the government from having so much control and telling us what to do. So sure. I have hope. I have faith.
Matter of fact, by the way, he's just down the road from us. Been trying to get him on. He's been kind of famous, and we've certainly appreciated him. I've met him, have my picture taken with him, but we've yet to get him on the program. But I have followed so many things that he's said, and certainly thankful for his military service and thankful for his common sense. So that's a good point. One of the things that my producer, Steve, has said, we need to talk about some of the positives. Next hour, actually, we're going to do a little bit of that with Jim Denison, but let's recognize that even in the midst of some of the concerns that we do have leaders rising up, bringing levels of common sense. And if there's one thing that you need inside the Beltway in Washington, D.C., it's more common sense. It seems to be in scarce, it seems to be in short supply, so anything we can do, that would be a very positive impact on the government. But just before I take a break, let me head up to Michigan this time and talk to Mark. Mark, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Well, I know with the pandemic, the schools being closed, I was wondering your thoughts on that. Since they're brainwashing and doing so much liberal indoctrination, how bad was it really to not have our kids in school?
I have heard more than one person say the same thing you've said. Matter of fact, after the break, I'm going to get into how there's been this back and forth about critical race theory and how the Washington Post decided to put out a hit piece on one of the leading critics of critical race theory, Christopher Rufo, who I do quote about in our latest Point of View booklet. And you go back and recognize that this may be part of the reason you're seeing so much of the reaction right now in the school boards, because if you go across this country or you go out on YouTube right now and watch these videos, it is amazing the number of parents that are protesting school boards. And part of that in the past has been because they've been teaching what almost ends up being pornography, but teaching all sorts of things to advance the LGBTQ agenda and trying to change views about gender and sexuality. But now the second part of that, more and more people complaining about talking about critical race theory and racism and whiteness and the rest. And I think part of that, Mark, gets back to the fact that parents were kind of having to hang around when their kids were getting Zoom, and they're going, is this what they're teaching in the schools? We got to have to protest this. So there are a number of people that have pointed that out. There's a good piece that showed that I think about 1 million students have, quote, dropped out from the public school system. Now, again, some of those may have just dropped out because they just stopped taking classes. I think some of them, quote, dropped out because their parents said, if that's all we're going to do, put a kid in front of a computer screen and learn all this secular, humanistic, progressive ideas, we're putting them into a Christian school or else we're going to homeschool them. But Mark, you got a good point. And I've heard more than a few people saying that maybe the lockdown had another positive, and that is we weren't working quite as hard and weren't as able as in the past to indoctrinate students with some of the things that were actually being taught in the school. So good point. I need to take a break, though. When we come back, since you brought up education, one of the other articles we have here, the liberal media, this is an article that we've posted from the Daily Caller, insists that conservatives can't define critical race theory, but they flub the definition themselves. And this is all about a hit piece against an individual that I have quoted before and actually has done quite a bit of research and documentation of this issue of critical race theory. And then just as a program note, don't forget that top of the hour, we will be talking with our good friend Jim Denison. So all that coming up right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Hey, for a few more minutes, let me get to the second article we've posted. Probably won't get to our third and fourth articles, and of course, there's always tomorrow. So we'll see if we can cover some of the things about what's happening in the border and a number of other topics. And of course, we'll have our good friend Gary Bauer with us. I'm sure he will lead us in a number of different directions as we cover some of those important topics. But this one is a piece came from the Daily Caller. Jordan Lancaster points out that there was a what you might call a hit piece from the Washington Post against one of the more prominent critics of critical race theory, and that individual is Christopher Rufo. We've mentioned him before on the program. I quote him in our upcoming booklet that's on critical race theory that's available to those of you that are donors. And it's not a surprise that they would actually criticize him, because as we have more and more information coming out about the way in which some of these so-called anti-racist whiteness tests and things like that are actually being used in the schools, it really harkens back to critical race theory. And the argument has been, well, this is something that is done in the law schools, which is true. This is something that is done in the graduate schools, also true. But it's not done in the high schools. False. Or the grade schools, false. Or that this has nothing to do with trying to change the attitudes of kids, false. But nevertheless, you don't even know what you're talking about, and that may be true for some people. They don't maybe understand all the nuances of critical race theory. Probably not true of people like Christopher Rufo. So then they have to come up with something else, and so they, in this particular article, begin to quote from maybe a few of his comments. And one of those was where he was talking about how, because this is getting a little bit more visibility, we've successfully, he said, frozen their brand. And so they criticized him for that. But I thought it was kind of interesting, because at one point they began to marshal the evidence against Christopher Rufo, and in virtually every case, as far as I can tell, they ended up saying something that was terribly inaccurate. And since this is the second article, I'd like you to read it for yourself, but let me go to the third page and just give you a few for instances. And for example, the article claimed that his appearance on Fox News, which happened months ago, was actually then followed immediately by going to the White House, talking to the Trump administration, which led the Trump administration to issue an executive order about diversity training. The Post had to come back and issue a correction to note that Christopher Rufo was not invited to the White House until months after the executive order was issued. Oops. Okay, this was another one. The article also claimed that this training that he talked about in Cupertino, California, and I've mentioned that on the air because I thought, okay, did we make a mistake when we mentioned that? Because they argued that this power and privilege training, which is part of critical race theory, in a Cupertino elementary school never happened. And I thought, okay, do we need to issue an apology for that as well? Oh, no. Turns out that later on, the Washington Post issued, quote, a clarification from the Cupertino superintendent that the lesson plan was presented, but then eventually was canceled. Okay, well, there's another one here. So you can begin to see that when you read these articles, and especially if it's an intended hit piece, sometimes the facts get a little slippery, and there is a classic illustration of that. Then, when it came time to have the Washington Post define what critical race theory is, and this is a direct quote, critical race theory holds that racism is systemic in the United States, not just a collection of individual prejudices, an idea that feels obvious to some and offensive to others. I can't think of anything more vague other than one time when I was seeing Ibram X. Kendi was asked, how do you define anti-racism? And he defines it by saying, anti-racism is when you're against racism. That's not what you put in your typical dictionary. Sorry about that. And so again, by the way, by the end of the article, as if there weren't already many examples, then this particular article quotes from the New York Post about officials in East Side Community School in Manhattan passing out literature, asking parents to reflect on their whiteness. They have 8 whiteness identities they had to pick. They give an example of public school district in Massachusetts doing a healing event and told white students they could not participate. Virginia Public School talking about white staff and all the rest. And so some of you have always asked, and we're going to probably spend a little more time on this tomorrow because I haven't posted this article, but I'll quote it now to give you a preview, because Mike Gonzalez, writing for the Daily Signal, actually testified recently in Loudoun County, Virginia, and actually comes up with 5 things that are easy to identify in terms of critical race theory. By the way, in our little booklet that we've put together on critical race theory at our point of view, I give you some of the kind of key words, but if you have something to write with, here's 1 through 5 real quickly, and we'll go through that in detail tomorrow when we have a little bit more time. But he says, first and foremost, is the bedrock principle of critical race theory is that racism is not individual. It's a conscious decision, or it's not even a conscious decision to be racist, because after all, it's all systemic. You know, it's part of our laws, it's institutions and everything. So we need to change our laws. We need to reform our institutions. We need to get rid of the capitalist system because it's so systemic. We just need to root it all out. Number 2, that behaviors and beliefs are inherent in identity categories. Thus, the members of these categories must not adopt American culture. In other words, we have to even reject American culture because it is systemic at its very base. Number 3, that white people receive unearned privilege at birth while other Americans are denied it. 4th principle is that meritocracy is a myth. Since the system, according to critical race theory, is rigged in favor of whites and against blacks, Hispanic, whatever, then even working within the system, trying to be successful, trying to earn merit is a failed enterprise. It just simply won't work because meritocracy is a myth. And the 5th and last tenet is that equity needs to replace equality. And we've talked a little bit about what the equity idea is, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But equity is not equality. Rather, we need to go out of our way to help those who have been oppressed, those who are victims. And so this is why you're hearing more and more discussion in the Biden administration about equity. So if nothing else, we'll get into some of those issues tomorrow. Come back to this whole idea of the coming, if you will, backlash to the situations in the border. But we'll cover that another day, because in just a few minutes we're going to have in studio with us Dr. Jim Denison. But before we do that, let me mention first of all that the articles I've been mentioning are on the website: the COVID class system, the critical race theory, and the establishment media. We will maybe tomorrow get into the Biden border backlash and the LGBTQ travel ban, and maybe some things about entitlements and spending and much more. Of course, Gary Bauer will be with us. But as you go to the website, one more time, let me mention that we have a banner. It says, "Be a difference maker." We want to make a difference in your life, and we want you to pay it forward to make a difference in the lives of others who will be hearing this program. We do encourage you, now that we're in the last 2 days, I know many of you like to wait to the last hours of the last day, but can we get a few of you today, maybe, if you might want to respond? We would greatly appreciate that. And we do have a matching fund on the table. And so if you have appreciated some of the things we cover here on Point of View, I'd certainly appreciate you considering what you might do to support this ministry. And again, you can click on that button that says Give Now. Or let me just mention, you can also talk to people off air if you'd like to put it on your credit card. That pledge line number is 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Jim Denison in studio right after these important messages.
We have just over a day remaining to make a difference together for the next 6 months. Many times we've had big opportunities, but this is one of the biggest that I can remember. Special Friends have thrown down a $65,000 challenge. If we can get friends like you to invest right now in Point of View, they will match every gift, dollar for dollar, up to $65,000. Now, compared to major networks and news shows and PBS, $65,000, not a big deal. They spend that in minutes. But for our efforts to combat fake news, to equip you to make a difference, it has rarely been bigger. Our fiscal year-end total will help define how much we can accomplish together for the remainder of 2021. So please step up and invest right now. Make a difference by visiting pointofview.net/difference or call 1-800-347-5151. Make double the difference. pointofview.net/difference, and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, as we've been promoting, we have in studio with us Dr. Jim Denison. By the way, if you'd like to ask a question, I know we got a number of comments and questions last hour. We may, again, get into some topics you would like to address. If not, you want to sit back and listen. If you're not familiar with the Denison Forum, well, I don't know why, because you've probably been hearing him on this program many times before, but we will give you the opportunity to go to denisonforum.org. You're going to see one of the articles we're going to post today is how to prepare for an uncertain future, and using as our illustration what happened in Surfside, Florida. But we'll also get into some of the others. A very good piece today about a man who saved a toddler who was honored by the Thunderbirds. And just the other day, the world's most premature baby really had 0% odds of survival. There it is. So again, we are going to obviously have some pro-life things to say, pro-family things to say. And of course, Jim Denison, Dr. Jim Denison, has his PhD as well as a Master of Divinity from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. He's been a pastor both in Texas and Georgia, and of course is the head of the Denison Forum. So Jim Denison, it was great to see you at NRB. Didn't I see you there?
You did, Kerby. So glad to see you as well, my friend. It was a privilege to be out there for one day and just to see the degree to which this is perhaps unkind to say in some ways, but just the celebrity with which you're held there. Just the degree to which people just saw you.
Well, I also brought some people to come meet you, too,
well,
so you saw that.
Very kind, very kind. But so glad to be in that space with you as well.
That was really good. Okay, this is from a few days ago, but again, if people do not receive the daily article, first of all, they should, and there's a way to sign up, and we've made it very easy if you go to our website, pointofview.net, and I might just mention that it's the second to the last day before both the Denison Forum and Point of View and their fiscal year. So we'll be talking about the importance of supporting your ministry. And of course, we've been talking about the importance of supporting us as well. But what a tragedy. I mean, here, an apartment building in Surfside, Florida collapses. You wrote about that, but it also was just a reminder that you can go to bed. And when I wake up in the morning, I'm just saying, thank you, Lord, that I woke up. Writing a book years ago on death and dying, I don't take my life or my health for granted, and I recognize that I have a lot of friends that one day were alive and the next day were not, or whether it was dying in bed or dying in a car crash or getting cancer diagnosis and they're gone within a week. I mean, we just don't have any guarantee that we have tomorrow, do we?
No, that's exactly right. We're familiar with the urgency of Scripture about Jesus' return, the fact that he could return now, could return this day, this moment, have to live in light of that, don't we? But, you know, we think of that and we think, well, it's been 2,000 years, maybe it'll be another 2,000 years. It may not be 20 minutes until he calls me home. When we're done with this conversation, I'm going to get back on LBJ, which is a religious experience in Dallas.
Yes.
We're going to be driving out there, and I just assume and hope that I'm going to make my way back to the office. But there are no guarantees. So a quick example of that. Years ago, I was pastoring First Baptist Church in Midland. That Sunday morning, I preached on judgment and the need to be ready to meet the Lord whenever that day might come. That night, we had an evening service back in those days and a fellowship afterwards because we're Baptists. And so we had to have a fellowship and some food and all that. An elderly couple came up to speak with me at this fellowship, wanted to thank me for the sermon that morning, told me that afternoon they took to heart my claim that they needed to make sure they're ready to meet God whenever that might be. So they prayed, they confessed any sin they needed to confess. They really just wanted their hearts to be right with God. And they wanted to thank me that night for that sermon. The next day, she died. Had a heart attack and died. The next day on Tuesday, I got a note from her in the mail. She had written it to me on Sunday, put it in the mailbox, in case she didn't see me that night. Died on Monday. I got the note on Tuesday, and I read it in her memorial service on Wednesday. Tomorrow's promised to none of us.
That is an incredible story. What about this situation in the apartment building? Because, as you said, it is, of course, a real question. And one of those is kind of the issue of fairness and God, and where was God and all those kinds of things. Can you help us out with that?
It is the large issue, isn't it? We're hearing stories now. One woman that was talking to her husband on her cell phone, telling her husband that the pool was collapsing, and then he hears a shriek, and they haven't found her. You know, there are others living on the other side of this condominium that are wondering if they're in danger. There are a number of buildings that were built around that same period of time, and now they're wondering as well. So as you know, and as you've spoken over the years so eloquently, there really are three things Christians uniquely believe in this space: that God is all-knowing, God is all-powerful, God is all-loving. Well, no other religion, as you know, fully believes all three of those statements. Because God was all-knowing, he saw this collapse before we did. Because he was all-powerful, you would think he could step in and miraculously intervene if he wished to do so. If he could calm the stormy Sea of Galilee and raise the dead, he certainly could have prevented this collapse. If he's all-loving, you would say he would want to, and yet he didn't. And so it's the question of innocent suffering, isn't it? Yet again. It was my father's question when he fought in the Second World War and never went to church again. Quite frankly, confessionally, it was my question when my son was diagnosed with cancer 8 years ago. I had prayed every single day for God to protect him from the moment we knew that he had been conceived. I didn't mean by that I knew that there would never be anything bad that would happen in his life, but I will say, nonetheless, the next day, after we got that diagnosis, I went for a long walk and I shook my fist at God. It was just human nature. If you're all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful, then why would you allow a tragedy like this? I think we all ask that question.
One of the other things you get into, again, I just love how you connect these things to the whole issue of persecution. And I've never really seen the number, but this is the first time I'd seen it, although maybe Rodney Stark has it in one of his books. But it's estimated that as many as you said, 2 million Christians died for their faith in the first few centuries of the Christian era. And this is a time when the church is expanding, but it's expanding while it also is being whittled down pretty dramatically through various emperors and other groups that were persecuting Christians.
No, that's right. In fact, the estimation is that there were as many as 7 million believers, and 2 million of them had been killed for their faith, is how historians put all those dots together. First time I went to Cuba, I told the pastor there that I was praying for persecution to lessen against his people. He asked me to stop doing that. He explained to me that persecution was purifying his church, that it was strengthening their faith. Then he told me that they were praying for persecution to increase in the United States for the same reason. And I will tell you that God answers Cuban prayers. So we're not seeing what North Koreans are seeing or what they're seeing in Cuba, what they're seeing in many places in the Muslim world. But nonetheless, as you know, we are seeing a rising opposition to the Christian faith that we've not seen, I think, in American history. And now is a time for us to understand we're all living in a condominium with cracks in the foundation.
Yes.
We're all living in a culture that may not last, and none of us has tomorrow promised. Today's the only day to trust that all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful God and know that he is still on his throne and he is still in charge.
And if you think about the two books that I recommend so often, both of them have persecution as their sub-theme. One, obviously, is major theme, and that is Live Not by Lies, Rod Dreher's book.
Yes.
And then the other one, of course, we had Erwin Lutzer in studio here. And, of course, a couple of weeks ago, we did an interview. So anytime I interview somebody twice on the same book, you know, I think it's very significant in terms of We Will Not Be Silent. But the subtitle is about courage and persecution. And one of the chapters is to be ready for that. So when we come back from the break, you also talk about this never-ending all-you-can-eat buffet. And by the way, if you are wanting to follow along, because we've posted this article, you can actually go to pointofview.net and you can follow along online, or you can print it out. And I think this would be a great family devotional. Of course, there are some other great things at Denison Ministries that could certainly help with your devotional. And, of course, you also have a section as well about Erwin Lutzer's book, Where Do We Go From Here? So there will be a lot of things we still haven't covered, but we need to take a break. And as we do so, let me just encourage you to go to the website. You can find out more about Jim Denison, the Denison Forum, Denison Ministries, and even find this article, all of it available at pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Most people would expect liberals to be open-minded, and yet they find that they are often the most intolerant. Kim Holmes explores the reason for this transformation in his new book, The Closing of the Liberal Mind. He was on my radio program to talk about the history of the radical change in mindset and attitude. Now, classical American liberalism in this country was based on a belief in liberty. Citizens were to be free from government coercion and thus free to believe something different from the orthodoxy forced on it by the state. They were also free to discuss and debate, and most importantly was a belief in true tolerance, which accepted the right and freedom of others to believe differently from you. It was a live and let live philosophy. I may disagree with your views, but I would defend your right to believe them. That is not the view of the postmodern left today. They practice the politics of intolerance. They may think that they are tolerant, but really live in a world where bigotry and discrimination are allowed against any view that is not politically correct. They are willing to stifle free thought, censor free speech, and use public shaming in order to suppress any idea they do not like. Now, in his book, he talks about the campus bullies, but we also discussed how this has moved into even the business world. Now we have corporate bullies willing to use economic power to stifle and suppress legislation they abhor. He says we have a new ruling class that is wealthy, smart, well-connected, and formidable. Although their numbers are small, actually in the thousands, their influence in the media, in the academy, and in government is significant. They also believe that they have a higher truth which is superior to the common wisdom of the day. You know, we're in a battle with a new kind of liberal mind, and that is why we need to read about the closing of the liberal mind. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again in studio today with a good friend, Jim Denison, who just brings so much to the table, and that's why we always say that you really need to find out about the Denison Forum and subscribe to the Denison material, but in particular the daily article. This one, again, talking about the building collapse, but then 3 biblical ways to prepare for an uncertain future. We've already talked about kind of this not if but when, but there's another part that you put in here, and I thought it was good, and it was convicting to me because you talk about the fact that we all know that Christians are being persecuted, but we kind of live in a world with a never-ending all-you-can-eat buffet. Speak about that, if you might.
I will. Yeah, a good friend of mine actually sent me the link to this article, and I thought it was just terrific. A philosopher named Chad Engel, and I need to quote this because he wrote it so well.
Yes.
Our waking lives more and more resemble a never-ending all-you-can-eat buffet. Consumables include movies, books, music, stuff with Amazon Prime, Spotify Premium, Netflix, and YouTube, among others, treating us to an unending smorgasbord of consumption. There's content, lots of it, and free with a paid subscription, making it hard not to binge watch, which is but the latest form of our binge buying and binge consuming. Well, I took that quote to say that you and I in our culture think that we're in charge. We're consumers. And the whole world tells us that if we'll just buy this or go there or do the other, that we'll be happier, that we'll be better, that you're in charge, Kerby. It's all about you. Look out for number one. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Pull your own strings. It's all about you, the culture says. And so when the Bible comes along to say, in this world you will have tribulation, Jesus says, blessed are you when men revile you and slander you. We don't want to hear that. We want to think we're in charge. We think we're on the throne. It goes back to Genesis 3. You will be as God, knowing good and evil. It's the basic, essential temptation we all face.
Well, and again, this consumer society, I even talk about it in my book on economics because it affects the way in which we go about our lives, and it sometimes leads to greed or covetousness or avarice. There's a word that you probably never hear in the church anymore, avarice. As a matter of fact, how many times have you even heard sermons on the 7 deadly sins? But it also is a problem in terms of our expectation. We start seeing God in a consumer mentality as well. And you've probably had a few people in the churches you've preached in over the years that are just kind of having a consumer mentality in church. Okay, I just quite like the way he preaches, so I'm going to go to the church down the street. And so there's a sense in which this has broader implications than just trying to necessarily prepare for the future, isn't it?
No question about that. You know, that famous parable that Kierkegaard told, or kind of a way in which he put it, metaphorical, in which when we come to church, we think we're the audience. We think that the preacher is the performer and maybe the choir or whatever, and we're here to measure the performance because we're the consumers here. When in fact, he says, God is the audience. The congregation of the performers, the preacher, the choir, whatever, are the directors of the performance. Their job is to help the congregation, which is the performer, perform well for the audience of one. And we get that backwards, don't we? In fact, as hard as this is to say, Kerby, I think we have, especially in the 80s and 90s and to some degree today, even done church around that idea that we're going to put everything around it, kind of a focus group driven, sort of a seeker sensitive kind of an approach. And I certainly want us to be accessible to the culture. I certainly want us to think about ways that we can attract people to Jesus. Of course, I mean that. But when we think primarily about them as a consumer, it's hard to make them disciples.
That's very true.
It's hard to turn that switch, isn't it?
One other point that you make, and this is already convicting enough, but we'll keep it going for a little longer, is the fact that we live in an unusual period in history. I can rattle off the names even of reformers, Tyndale, Wycliffe, John Bunyan. I mean, whatever. I mean, these are people that were in prison. These are people that were executed. And, of course, we know that that exists before. In even the book of Hebrews, we have the testimony of those who were beheaded and sawn in two and all the rest. And we certainly know Fox's Book of Martyrs. But there is a sense in which we forget that generally persecution has been the situation that most believers have faced most
historically,
of the time.
Absolutely the case. But again, because I'm a consumer and I think it's all about me, and then if the church comes along and adds to it this layer that's not in the article, but it's this idea that if I just pray enough, God wants me always to be materially happy and prosperous. This kind of health and wealth sort of an idea. And I do believe God's my Father. I believe He wants my best. But I think Jesus was pretty clear in saying that the best doesn't always by any means guarantee material happiness, material success. In fact, Jesus said the opposite, didn't He? Each of His disciples martyred for following Jesus, except John, who was exiled on the island of Patmos. I remember my first time to go where Bunyan had been imprisoned and seeing the actual door. They've still got it in the museum there, in what they call the Bunyan Museum, where he paid such a price for the faithfulness with which he wanted to serve Jesus, with which he was willing to serve Jesus. I remember going into the cave at Patmos, where John had been exiled because he wouldn't give up his faith in Christ. My minor and my doctoral work was in English Reformation history and had a special attraction to the Lollards and to, as you know, what was done when that decision was made to translate the Bible into English and the price with which so many really gave their lives. William Tyndale, 90% of the King James came from William Tyndale. He was burned at the stake for translating the Bible into English. He wanted the boy behind the plowshare to have a Bible that he could read. So we do live in a heritage that says you ought to expect to pay a price, you ought to be willing to pay a price, and you want to be ready right now to pay that price.
That's just incredible. One of the points that you made before we take a break is that those days are ending because now we have the Equality Act, we have the attack on religious freedom. Friday we'll probably talk a little bit about some of the threats to religious freedom and whatever it might be. And getting back to Rod Dreher's book, he's saying that there are people that grew up in Poland or Czechoslovakia or Hungary or maybe even Russia itself coming to this country and saying, this looks a lot like what we just left, and we didn't expect that to happen in America, but that may be the lot for many of us in the future as Christians.
That's certainly what the trajectory looks like. You go back to Solzhenitsyn's famous address when he was describing the degree to which America was looking more like the Russia that he was so oppressed by. Well, I know right now, if I was hearing this conversation, it would be easy for me to say, well, I can't see that myself. It doesn't look like we're at that place myself. Maybe this is just kind of hyperbole, or maybe you're trying to make us concerned about about this so that we'll watch or follow or give or whatever. As God is our witness, and knowing Kerby as I know Kerby, that is not our heart. We genuinely do believe that we're in this permissive stage of God's judgment, back to Romans 1, where God is allowing us the consequences of our sins. Tony Evans says it so well that when you sin against God, you have freedom to sin, but you're not in charge of the consequences of that. That's because he's king. And the consequence of your sin is that you're going to see the results of your sin. And we're seeing that. It's a Romans 1 movement. If we won't repent then, Kerby, it gets worse. God deals with us as gently as he can or as harshly as he must. And we're in that moment, I believe, in God's history.
Just before we end this section, you have 3 steps. Choose to pay the price of your convictions before the bill comes due. I love that line. Ask the Holy Spirit to empower you before you need his power. And remember the commitment others have made before you need to make your own. Help us out with that.
You bet on the first. We decide now before the pressure comes, before the stress comes, so that we'll be faithful when it comes. We decide right now. We say, Lord, I'm going to be a living sacrifice today. I'm going to live a crucified life today. I'm going to surrender my life to you today, whatever tomorrow means. Well, the second step I need to take is to ask the Holy Spirit to help me do that. I'm just as fallen as anybody else, just as willing to lack courage as anybody else. So every day I ask the Spirit to control me, to empower me, to enable me to have the courage and the boldness that I need when the moment of testing comes. And then it helps me on that third level to remember what others have done. So it encourages me with what it is that I need to do. So now you've had Erwin in recently. He's got this story in his book, if I could tell it very quickly. Where do we go from here? Terrible Boxer Rebellion in China, the turn of the previous century. The long story short is that these trying to assault the Christian faith, it came to a school. They put a Bible, a cross flat on the ground. They said to the students coming out, if they would trample on the cross, they could live. If they went around the cross, they would die. Firing squad in front. First 7 students coming out trample on the cross. The 8th is a girl who kneels before the cross and then walks around it and faces the firing squad. And then Erwin Lutzer says, strengthened by her example, every one of the more than 90 students followed her to death. If they could die for Jesus, can't we live for Jesus?
What a great line. And again, they were called the Boxer Revolution because they were practicing gymnastics and calisthenics and those kinds of things. People always wonder where that came from. You know, we are going to come to a break, but one of the things we're encouraging people to do is recognize that we have a banner that says, be a difference maker. And I know you're really dedicated to that as well, because our argument is that we really want to make a difference in the lives of our listeners, but we also want them to pay it forward so that others will see a difference in their lives because they have a chance to hear Jim Denison right here on the program and to hear the program. So we wanted to encourage you today to, first of all, consider what you might do to support Point of View. And as I mentioned, we have a matching fund. And so I want you to think about doing a twofer. Number 1 is to consider what you might do, especially since we're almost at the end of our fiscal year. That ends tomorrow. Now, number 2, click on the button that says See More and click on the picture there of Jim Denison, and you can support his organization as well. He has been a great partner in all of this. That's one of the reasons we wanted to have him here today, because he can talk about the things that are happening here at Point of View, and we can talk about the things that he's doing through the incredible ministries that exist, not only at the Denison Forum, but when we come back, we'll talk about Denison Ministries and tell you some really incredible and encouraging stories. All that coming up right after this.
We have just over a day remaining to make a difference together for the next 6 months. Many times we've had big opportunities, but this is one of the biggest that I can remember. Special Friends have thrown down a $65,000 challenge. If we can get friends like you to invest right now in Point of View, they will match every gift, dollar for dollar, up to $65,000. Now, compared to major networks and news shows and PBS, $65,000, not a big deal. They spend that in minutes. But for our efforts to combat fake news, to equip you to make a difference, it has rarely been bigger. Our fiscal year-end total will help define how much we can accomplish together for the remainder of 2021. So please step up and invest right now. Make a difference by visiting pointofview.net/difference or call 1-800-347-5151. Make double the difference. Pointofview.net/difference and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Jim Denison in studio. And in just a few minutes, thought we'd tell you a couple of really encouraging stories. We want to do more and more in this area of positive stories. And of course, one of the places where you will receive some of these positive stories is in the daily article. So Jim, just before we go back to some of these articles, let's talk about that. The daily article comes out every day. It shows up in your inbox. It's free, but I do want to encourage people that you have a goal. I think think of raising $150,000 by tomorrow night. And so we'll see how that goes for you. But let's talk about what's available first at Denison Forum and then all of the Denison ministries, because I want people to connect up with you, and we have some links on our website.
Kerby, thank you so much. It's just so kind of you. You're such an encourager, and I'm so grateful to you, my friend. Just like you, we're called to try to help people engage the culture effectively with the good news of God's love. And so really, at the end of the day, Denison Ministries is an umbrella that has underneath it 5 brands that will help people to do that. Denison Forum, the place where I spend most of my time, helps people think biblically about cultural issues so they can redeem these issues and use their influence more effectively. So that's the daily article, that's podcasts, that's video content, that's books, that's white papers, all of which is at denisonforum.org. And the digital content's all free. We're donor-based, so we can give all that away. Then alongside that, my wife's Bible teaching ministry at janetdenison.org is Expository Bible. That's what she's been doing for 30 years. And she is, quite frankly, one of the finest Bible teachers I've ever known. She has all of her content available in video, has it there in written content as well. And that's at janetdenison.org. First15.org, first15.org is a 15-minute encounter with God. My son Craig actually started that. It's first of all, it's a worship video, then it's a devotional that he's written, and it's a guided prayer time. And we're seeing remarkable responses to that. Millions of people that are following First 15 as a podcast or with the video resources. They've created their own album of music now, as well as the devotional content itself. And then some years ago, my wife started ChristianParenting.org to help parents raise children to know and follow the Lord. Now we have scores of writers and aggregators that are in that space, ChristianParenting.org. And then last, PastorsView.org is our leadership site, where we exist to equip pastors and other leaders, CEOs, to be able to follow Jesus and use their influence more effectively. If you go to DenisonMinistries.org, you'll see all of those available in one place.
And I might just mention, we've had both of your sons on the program, one in studio and the other by phone, and we've had one of the pastors that helped you with the pastors conference. So you can go back, and if you type in the word Denison, 1N, Denison, you will be able to find all of those interviews, and it's all available, of course, through your ministry, but also we have a link to it on our ministry here as well. And I thought before we get back to this, I think it's fair to tell people that you are one of the busiest people I've ever met. And why in the world would somebody as busy as you decide to drive all the way over town here, take your life in your hands by driving on 75 to do radio? So I think you actually see the value of what we do here on Point of View.
Absolutely. And you have not understated the risk that one takes in driving on 75 to 635 here in North Dallas. It is a religious experience. It absolutely is an opportunity to pray. There's no doubt about that. Chris drove and I prayed is how we got here a little bit ago. And that's probably the right role for both of us to be in to do this. Kerby, I have been such a fan of what you've been doing for decades. You didn't ask me to do this, but I just want to say I've just been so grateful for your intellect, for your heart, for your mind, for your scientific background, your work at Yale, all the ways in which you have such secular credential to speak into these cultural issues. And I'm so grateful that you and Suzanne have been called by God to give your lives and your talents to equipping us now to understand the culture, to respond more biblically and effectively to cultural issues. And so what you do here in this point of view opportunity is, in my mind, like nothing else. And that's why whenever I have a chance to be on with you or to point people to you, to invite people to support you financially, I am always so excited to do that because I so believe, I'm all in. I so believe in who you are and what you do in this incredible team you have.
Well, thank you. Again, daily article. Let's pick out the one today. The man who saved a toddler, honored by riding with the Thunderbirds. Now, I'm sure my producer, Steve, would say, okay, how do I get on that Air Force Thunderbird ride? But nevertheless, here's a man who jumps into the ocean to save a toddler. But tell the story, because these are the kind of encouraging stories we need to talk about every once in a while here on Point of View.
Yeah, and it's encouraging. It truly is. So Ocean City, Maryland, there's a bay there called the Osawaman Bay. I think it's an Indian name. And so there was a multi-vehicle crash on the Route 90 bridge over this bay. 23-month-old girl fell out of a car in the crash into the water. A man who was also in the crash, who was involved in this thing, named Jonathan Bauer, saw what was happening. He jumped 25 feet into the water to save this toddler's life. As a result, last Friday, he was honored by the Thunderbirds by being selected to ride in the back of an F-16 as part of their Hometown Hero program. And in the story, there's a picture of Jonathan Bauer in the back seat of this Thunderbird jet fighter. The Thunderbirds are one of, I think, America's most iconic groups. I'm so grateful who they are and what they are. My good friend Ross Perot Jr. is actually an honorary member of the Thunderbirds. He emailed me this morning and told me that he'd be sending my story to the Thunderbirds off of what I wrote this morning.
What a great story.
He's so grateful for them, as I am grateful for the patriotism and the sacrifice that they represent. And so to see these two things together, this obvious hero who would risk his life to save a toddler he'd obviously never met before, and then to be honored by the heroes that the Thunderbirds are, is a cool collision of stories, I think.
Yes. Well, and again, as you said, if the he waited for the professionals, that would have been too late. And we might even remember back when you had the crash that was in Washington, D.C., one of the first times when President Ronald Reagan decided to honor a hero, one of those individuals that jumps into the Potomac. And you have some wonderful stories like this that we need to recognize, and at a time when we see, unfortunately, too many YouTube videos where there's been altercation or a fight, and then somebody's on the ground bleeding and they just walk past them. It's nice to know that we still have heroes, and I'm glad that whether it's the Thunderbirds or the Blue Angels or whatever, honor some of those people. So that's just a wonderful and encouraging story. But I thought I'd get to another one, because yesterday you talked about the world's most premature baby, which is interesting to me as well, because as we begin to have more and more advances in neonatology, it really begins to affect, which I know you will want to talk about in just a minute, that whole decision of Roe versus Wade, which was based upon the idea of viability. And the word viability has changed dramatically over the last few decades. But first of all, here is Richard Scott William Hutchison, born 5 months premature. Ladies out here, pay attention to this, weighing 11.9 ounces. Oh, my goodness.
In fact, his parents could hold him in a single palm of their hands. His wife went into premature labor, and that's what happened. That's why he had to be born at such an early age. He spent 6 months in the hospital. He was given a 0% odds of surviving. On June the 5th, he celebrated his first birthday. Demonstrates all life is precious to God and should be precious to us as well.
It's a great picture, too. By the way, one of the advantages of the daily article is if you have a color printer, then you also get some of these pictures that you pull out there. He looks like a good, strapping young fellow, and I think he's going to do just fine. But there are some implications, and I would be remiss if I did not talk to an individual who is a medical ethics consultant to Baylor Scott White about the obvious implications of this. What are those?
Yeah, thank you. So it's what's called voluntary termination of pregnancy in the medical world. It's what we think of as elective abortion. So abortions, as we all know, have, since Roe v. Wade legalized abortion, have been conducted on a variety of levels. There are some abortions to save the life of the mother. There are some because of fetal deformity incompatible with life. Those would be the only two conditions by which Baylor Scott and White and Health would perform a voluntary termination of pregnancy. And then obviously there's a question about rape and incest and the degree to which that should be a legal condition for abortion, which is an issue to discuss. But 93% of all abortions have nothing to do with any of that, Kerby. 93% are purely elective.
Right.
And when studies have been done to ask women why they chose these abortions, the number one reason is financial. Believing they just didn't have the means to raise a child or another child. Other issues have had to do with family stigma. They've had to do with just being too busy. They've had to do with just not wanting another child in their life. Back to what we said before, we've convinced ourselves we're consumers, and life is a means to our end, and therefore we can make decisions about what we consider to be our bodies. It's an implication of the sexual revolution. Your body's yours to do with as you wish, whether it's your gender identity, your sexual orientation, or your decision to end another life. It is truly this culture of death, as the Roman Catholic Church says, that we're facing right now. And this is an example of the joy that comes when you don't make that choice, when you choose for life instead.
Let's talk about the solutions after the break, because lots of times I've said on this program that if you're against something, you should be for something. And obviously, in this case, if you say, well, if it's an unplanned pregnancy, what do you offer as a solution? Oh, I don't know. It might be the pregnancy resource centers around the country. We have 3 times as many pregnancy resource centers centers in this country as we have abortion clinics. So we're winning the war of ideas. We need to come back and talk about that for just a minute. You got a good piece here as well about God anoints all he appoints. And that's, if nothing else, a great comment from Craig Denison, who you know as well. So we'll come back and talk about that right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Dr. Jim Denison here. And again, as we're coming to the end of the program today, we're also coming, as tomorrow will be the end of our fiscal year. So we certainly encourage you to do what you can to support Denison Forum and Point of View. But I thought for just a minute, I wanted to tee this up for you because we've said so many times, Jim, that when we as Christians are known by the world for what we disagree with, what we are against, I think it is more incumbent upon us than ever to talk about what we're for. And so if indeed there ever were to come a time when abortion would be outlawed by the Supreme Court, that would we go back to what happened before Roe versus Wade, one of the questions would be, well, what are you going to do for women that have unplanned pregnancies or unexpected pregnancies or a crisis pregnancy? And the answer is we have pregnancy resource centers around the country, and we also have a desire of of a lot of couples to adopt a child, and it's very difficult to do so. So in some respects, we do have solutions for some of the things that we're talking about today, don't we?
We absolutely do. And that's a place where the church can be more intentional about telling the story, as you did just now. We don't want to just be pro-birth. We want to be pro-life, don't we? We want to be pro-life for the entire family, for the biological father, as well as the biological mother, and the grandparent, speaking as a grandfather. And so the church has that opportunity now to step into this space. I mentioned before, for instance, that the number one reason, 28% of all abortions reportedly are because of financial stress. Why can't we do something about that? Why can't? Well, we can. We can be available to women. If you're hearing us right now and you have an unplanned pregnancy or a problem pregnancy and you don't know what to do financially about all of that, there are churches, there are ministries, there are problem pregnancy centers that are available to you right now, that are waiting on your call, waiting on you to reach out to them, as well as believers and friends and pastors that would want to adopt and to help. And then, as Kerby said, adopting children is something I'm seeing more and more believers want to do and be able to do and would want to walk with you through this. There are open adoptions now. One of my best friends, for instance, was fostering and now adopted a little boy in an open adoption kind of a context and has been able to do this, and the mother's been able to be involved. And so there are all sorts of ways in which adoption can be a wonderful way of giving life to this child and to yourself as well. But do know this, if you make the horrible choice of abortion, as so many women have, on the other side of that, there is a grief, there is a guilt, there's a loss that women tell me they live with literally the rest of their lives. Don't make that choice. Yes. God is with you. God is for you. God redeems all he allows. He wants to redeem this story. You may know the name of Ethel Waters, the marvelous gospel singer who was herself the product of a rape. I had a student at Southwestern Seminary whose mother was raped by a German officer in World War II. And this older student of mine back in the 80s at the seminary was himself an evangelist, going into prisons and doing evangelistic ministries. And that was his story. God redeems all he allows, and he will redeem even your crisis if you'll ask him to help you do that.
And again, we've had sitting in this chair individuals like James Robison and Richard Land and others whose mothers had every justification for abortion, but for one reason or another actually decided to give birth to those individuals that are still having a great ministry like that. And just for a minute, since you do actually work with doctors in hospitals, here is one of the things that I think has got to be so difficult for people in the medical profession, because down one corridor in many of these hospitals, these doctors may be working feverishly to try to save the life of this premature child in neonatology, and down another corridor, they may actually be terminating a child of the same gestational age. And the schizophrenia that you have to engage in the midst of that has got to be damaging to our medical professionals.
I think it has to be as well. And then part of the irony of that is, in so many conditions, if the child survives the abortion, then, and we're trying to get legislation in place to codify all of this, then it must be protected by the very same doctor that just tried to take its life. If this baby moves 6 inches from inside the mother's womb to outside the mother's womb, now it acquires all the rights and protections that you and I do. But when it's still in its mother's womb, it doesn't. The illogic of that is so difficult, even for healthcare providers. You're exactly right. This Hippocratic oath to do no harm is at the heart of the medical practice, of the medical profession. The wiring that causes a person to want to give their life to medicine is to do no harm, is to do only good. And so really, I think there is, in so many places, a real burden and a real pain that comes into the hearts of those who have chosen to do this. We don't do that at Baylor, as I said. We will only do that to save the life of the mother if the child will not survive anyway, if it's fetal deformity incompatible with life. But for those that are in that space, I think we can pray for God to even be redeeming there and using their stories to bring them to a better place.
Well said. I did mention something which I quoted from Craig Denison, your son, that God anoints all he appoints. And that's something that I thought we would end on, because it's something else, because the idea here is that there are so many people I've run into say, well, I just couldn't do that. I couldn't be a missionary. I couldn't do the kinds of things you do. But you know what? God actually equips and empowers people to fulfill that calling. Can you speak to that issue?
Absolutely. In many ways, in my mind, it goes back to the fellow who jumped off the bridge to save the toddler. If he'd waited for the professionals, the baby likely would have died, right? Well, there are no professionals in the kingdom of God. Clergy and laity isn't in the Bible. I would challenge anybody hearing us right now to go find the word clergy in the Bible or laity in the Bible. Kerby, I know you know the story here. It's in the 3rd century. The church is outgrowing its Jewish-Palestinian roots. It's getting into the larger Greco-Roman world. There starts to be a concern about heresy in the church. So Cyprian of Carthage, church in AD 250 comes forward and says, well, here's the solution. We'll take that 1 to 3% that maybe are called to be the pastors or the church leaders. We'll call them the clergy. Coins the word, we think, which means the called out ones, as separate from the laity, from the Greek word laos, or the people. And we'll say these are the only ones we're going to let do theology and preach, and we'll put everybody over to the side. Dividing clergy from laity was one of the most insidious strategies of the enemy, and he still does it today. This idea, if you can't read Greek and Hebrew, if you didn't go to the seminary, you can't share your faith. It's unbiblical. It's a heresy. Imagine the Mavericks with their new coach, Jason Kidd, being the only guy that could touch the baseball or basketball. Wouldn't even let Luka Doncic take a shot, let's say. How good are they going to be at that?
Yeah.
How good are the Cowboys going to be if the coach is the only guy that can touch the football? If the person that runs Baylor Scott and White Health, my good friend, is the only person that can see a patient? Well, that's a typical church. Where we've convinced ourselves if I show up and pay their salary, they'll go do the job and I'll wait back. Well, I can tell you, people hearing us right now are missionaries where you live. Mm-hmm. You are missionaries to neighbors no pastor could reach. You are missionaries to colleagues and to students and to friends who can see Jesus in you and be drawn to Jesus in them. You will be the Bible they will read. You will be the sermon they'll hear if you're willing to be used by God today.
And again, it's not like I wait for the evangelist, because evangelism is good news, and you are to testify. Well, I've seen lots of people, or give witness to. I've been in some jury trials, and the people that give witness, they're not the experts, they're not the lawyers, they're not the judges, they just tell their story. And so you can be an evangelist by telling your story, right?
That's exactly right. A lot of the time when we have that opportunity, we feel like we're on trial. We feel like Satan's the prosecutor, and the person we're talking to is the jury, and we kind of feel like we're the one on trial. Jesus is on trial. Satan's the prosecutor, the Holy Spirit's the defense attorney, person you're talking to is the jury. You're just called to the stand. Your job is to tell what you know and leave the results with the Holy Spirit. You may be the first person called to the stand and never hear how the jury decides. Might be the last one and hear the jury decide. You'll probably be in the middle someplace, but your job is to be faithful. If you'll be faithful, you'll plant trees you never sit under, and God will use you for his glory.
So good. Again, I do commend to you Jim Denison, denisonforum.org. I know they have a desire to try to end their fiscal year, which is tomorrow in the black. I know we do as well. And so thank you for taking that dangerous ride down 75 we've been talking about to come and join us. And I look forward to the next opportunity.
Such a privilege for me. God bless, my friend.
Just before we say goodbye, let me just mention that we have a couple of articles that we've posted for you to read. We have a link to Denison Forum and, of course, this one particular article about how to prepare biblically for uncertain future and for uncertain times. And don't we live in uncertain times today? So I think you're going to find all the great material that comes from the Denison Forum and the daily article. It's all available at our website, pointofview.net. Banner one more time, be a difference maker. We have a matching fund, and if you have not given, this would be a great time to click on that banner or give us a call, 800-347-5151. I want to thank Andrew and Steve. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
We have just over a day remaining to make a difference together for the next 6 months. Many times we've had big opportunities, but this is one of the biggest that I can remember. Special Friends have thrown down a $65,000 challenge. If we can get friends like you to invest right now in Point of View, they will match every gift, dollar for dollar, up to $65,000. Now, compared to major networks and news shows and PBS, $65,000, not a big deal. They spend that in minutes. But for our efforts to combat fake news, to equip you to make a difference, it has rarely been bigger. Our fiscal year-end total will help define how much we can accomplish together for the remainder of 2021. So please step up and invest right now. Make a difference by visiting pointofview.net/difference or call 1-800-347-5151. Make double the difference. Pointofview.net/difference and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.